Hi everybody, I'm Doc Miles, Doc Miles Photo Tours and Luke Brothers Photo Adventure Workshops. Adobe Lightroom 7.3 was a big change for Lightroom, the biggest change in 10 years. And what they've done is they've included some brand new profiles. The profiles used to be down in the calibration menu, and not too many people knew about them, not too many people went there. If you did know about them, you went and selected one and you looked at it and you said, okay, hey, that looks good, I'll start there. Now they moved them up to the basic panel and it's changed the game completely. And they've added 40 different new profiles. So let's learn what profiles are and what they do and what the subtleties of each one are. So let's get right into it in Lightroom. So let's talk about what the new Lightroom Classics and Lightroom CC and Lightroom Mobile profiles are. Now, they've been in Lightroom for over 10 years, and they've been buried down here in the calibration pane, where you would be able to select from 4 different Adobe ones plus the ones that your camera have built in. So they've moved them now, where they probably should have been all along, as a starting point up to the basic panel. So if you go up here to the basic panel, you'll see the first thing you come to is called Profile. And then you can click on this grid over here and actually see a preview of what these profiles are. If you mouse over the previews, it'll actually change the whole picture, so you can actually get a much better preview of the whole image with these different profiles. So let's talk about what they are. The Adobe profiles that have been in the system for a long time, over 10 years, have been upgraded. And they used to have Adobe Standard, Adobe Landscape, Adobe Neutral, Adobe Portrait, and Adobe Vivid. They still have those in the basic ones, but they've been improved greatly. For example, Adobe Standard was designed to really be a great starting point for photos. And that's what these things really are. They're a starting point. They don't change any of your sliders. They're not like presets where you click on a preset and all the sliders move. This is a starting point to give your photograph a certain look before you start any editing. Think about this. If you take a JPEG photograph, whether it's with your phone or a camera, you can set that camera to say whether you want it to be a landscape or a portrait or all different kinds of scenes, as they call them in some things. A JPEG is already processed. It's not a raw photo. With a raw photo, nothing has been done to it. So until now, you had to come into Adobe with your raw photo, which has nothing done to it, and select one of these profiles. And if you didn't select it, it just chose Adobe Standard to change the tonality and the contrast and so forth, give you a starting point. Now you have all this creativity in the starting point of your photograph. So think of these things as a starting point. Let's talk a little bit about what Adobe Standard really was. It was a great starting point that really enabled photographers to get the most out of their editing. And while it was created 10 years ago, Adobe's learned a lot about photographers and what they want, and they've got, through the feedback they got, they can make things even better. So they added Adobe Color. Adobe Color was designed to greatly improve the look and rendering of warm tones. So your reds and your hues that are around the red spectrum basically get warmed up a little bit, and the contrast is increased. But one thing it does do is it protects skin tones. So your skin tones will stay the same. They won't look ruddy or they won't look oversaturated at all. Adobe Color, also one of the best things about Adobe Color, it gives a slight boost to the global contrast of the photograph, just a little bit. So when you start with Adobe Color, such as this, and we'll select Adobe Color here, as opposed to what it was like Adobe Standard, a little bit different, not much, but you can see a little bit more warming in the warm tones here, particularly in the rocks and in the flowers. When this image was opened, it had no profile whatsoever. It looked kind of bland. So now it opens up by default in Adobe Color. Since, skin tones are the most important thing if there's an individual in a photograph, the really cool thing about this is that it totally protects the skin tones. Then you have Adobe Neutral and Adobe Vivid. They're the complete opposites of each other. Adobe Neutral basically leaves everything the way it was, And you can see the difference between Adobe Color and Adobe Neutral. There's a big difference. This is a little bit flatter, doesn't look quite as much punch to it, but it gives a good starting point if you want total creativity. Adobe Neutral has very little contrast, very little hue saturation, very little of anything. So it's a good starting point if you want all the creativity. But on the other hand, Adobe Vivid gives it a lot more punch, a lot more contrast, and warms things up considerably. Now that's a big difference between the two. And as a landscape photographer, I usually use Adobe Vivid or Adobe Landscape. Adobe Landscape and Adobe Portrait. Adobe Landscape was basically created for photographers to apply based off the subject matter of the photograph. Adobe Landscape improves the saturation a little bit and the contrast, but the saturation of the greens and the blues. So Adobe Landscape is basically designed for landscape photography, which this photograph is. So when you select Adobe Vivid, you'll notice it's a lot more punch to it. There's a lot more shadows, a lot darker here. Adobe Landscape gives a little bit better rendition in terms of, gives more definition in this rock, and it also gives you a little more punch in the greens and in the blues. And then there's Adobe Portrait. That completely protects the skin tones. Adobe Portrait takes all the tonality and removes any skin hue and tonality protections, making sure that there's no problem with skin tones in the photograph. So that's used for people who do fashion photography and so forth. But so those are the four basic ones. Then you have the camera matching ones. The camera matching profiles basically are the ones that match up to your brand of camera, whether you're a Sony, Nikon, Canon, or any camera you use that shoots RAW, and you shoot RAW, and it has your camera profile there. In this case, I shoot Nikon, so I have all these different ones to choose from. The last one that we have to cover is Adobe Monochrome. That's a good start for black and white photography. It essentially gives the photograph a good point for creativity. And then if you want, you can go in and make your sliders and increase the reds or whatever and the greens and make it all what you want it to be like, but it's a good starting point. The camera matching ones also have the same thing. We have camera matching landscape, neutral, portrait. Those come from the information in your camera. So when you load a photograph and the metadata that's in your photograph, Adobe Lightroom can recognize that you have a certain camera, and it will give you those profiles based on what your camera is designed to do in terms of profiles. And then we have the legacy ones, which are those are the old ones that Lightroom had that go back to the 10 years ago. And now Adobe's added more than 40 artistic ones. Now some of these are pretty far out in terms of what they do to the color. It's more like what you see on Instagram or Snapseed when you want a really wild look to your photograph that's totally different from anything else. And for example, that one is Artistic 1. Artistic 5, for example, would look something like that. This is Artistic 8. You know, this isn't something I'm going to use all the time. There are some really good black and white ones, and there's 17 of those. And you have a black and white yellow filter, red filter. It really does a nice job of giving you great black and white. Now this red filter is going to make these flowers really pop, and it's going to darken everything behind it, kind of that Ansel Adams look, if you will. The yellow filter, on the other hand, isn't going to be quite as dramatic, and the green filter is going to bring out from the green channel. But you can see the difference in these. And then there's 10 modern ones. The modern ones are a little bit artistic, a little bit different. You have Modern 2, Modern 1. You can go through these and figure out what they all do. There's really no sense in defining every one of them. And then you have the vintage ones, which are down here. There's 10 of those. They mimic different films from the old days. For example, vintage 9 would look like something you shot back in the 70s, or with like something like that would come out of a camera in the late 60s or 70s. And then you can buy different ones. Matt Kloskowski has a package that he gave away for free when this first came out. He's got some very interesting profiles, and you can add your own or do whatever you want in terms of adding different ones. He's got landscape ones, he's got portrait ones, and wedding ones. You can create your own profiles. That's the subject of another tutorial altogether, but that's what these profiles essentially do. They are a good starting point. Once you've chosen a profile, you can close the window and begin to make your adjustments, whether you want to increase more contrast or you want to drop the highlights a little bit, or whatever you want to do. Or, auto's great because it uses machine learning now. Gives you a great starting point, and you can add a little bit more contrast. Still, that Adobe Color is lying over the top of it, and that's your base point. So I hope you understand this. I hope it clears it up a little bit for you, why these things are so important. It's an incredible increase in improvement in Lightroom. It's something that is revolutionary in terms of what they've done. And there are other third-party post-processing programs out there that have certain sliders like this, but they're presets basically. They're not profiles. So this is a good start, and I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, hit the like button below and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And this is Doc Miles of Doc Miles Photo Tours, also of Loop Brothers Photo Adventure Workshops, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.